Go that one. Okay, so welcome to the first ever office hours session for Thoughtful Leader. And I thought I do a lot of leadership training and coaching work, obviously, so I'm always looking at the latest leadership things and models and tools and techniques. So I thought it'd be good to share some of that with some of my Thoughtful Leader subscribers because I probably don't do enough of this. So yeah, in this first part, I'm just going to do a little bit of a presentation. So 10, maybe 10 to 15 minutes of on motivation models and how you might use them in your team. And then I'm going to just open it up for a general Q&A. So that part of the session won't be recorded. So, and if you do have any questions along the way, feel free to put up your hand and we can answer those on the call as well, or just whack them in the chat. So the agenda here is going to be pretty simple, a bit of an overview on motivation in general, and then we'll look at one of the ways I think about motivation, which is on the motivation spectrum, is what I call it. We'll look a little bit about turning theory into practice. So motivation theories are cool and the models are nice, but you need to turn them into something practical, so actually use them for something. And then I'll cover some useful motivation models, which I quite like. And after that, we'll move into that unrecorded Q&A bit. So motivation in general can be thought of in this way. Performance equals ability times motivation. So as you can see, if you want to get good performance, yes, it's good to have highly skilled team members, but if there's no motivation there, then that multiplier is going to reduce the effectiveness of that individual. And there's other ways to think about motivation as well in terms of intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. So intrinsic motivation is your internal drive to do a good job or to enjoy the work that you do. And extrinsic motivation is all about external motivation factors, such as, well, you get a reward if you hit this target. And so it's been found that intrinsic motivators are more sustainable, which makes more sense because intrinsic motivators are part of the person and therefore they're more likely to be able to, be sustained for the long term. Whereas extrinsic motivators like giving people a reward or a bonus or something like that, they're often fleeting in that you can't continue to give people rewards all the time, for example, or give them dire consequences for not performing. So extrinsic motivators are still useful, but not really a sustainable form of motivation. So just in a basic sense, that's how I define motivation. But when I'm thinking about motivation in general, I like to think of it like this. And this is not a theory or a model or anything that I've done. This is more, my way of thinking about it. So to start with, I think, and you can see on the spectrum here, we're going from low to high. So low on the left, high on the right-hand side here. And in this example here, you've got Bob and Sarah. Bob, they're the two names I always use for everything, if you've read any of my stuff. So, but what you'll see there is Bob's level of motivation in general is different to Sarah's. So earlier in my career, I used to find myself getting quite frustrated when certain people weren't as motivated as others. And so I was hoping they would be, rise to the occasion or start to become more motivated. But then over time, I realized that everyone has their own level of motivation relative to others. And so Bob, for example, might just have other things in his life that he likes. So outside of work, hobbies, whatever it is. And Sarah might be more career oriented. And so she's really putting in the most effort at work and is really engaged in her career. So when I think about motivation now, all I think about is getting Bob and Sarah to the top of their motivation level relative to where they're at. So rather than wishing Bob was like Sarah, I'm more thinking Bob's motivation levels, we want them up the top there. We want them as high as they can be. And with Sarah, I want her motivation levels to be as high as they can be as well. So you're pushing to the right of the motivation spectrum there, rather than pretending that everyone's going to have the same level of motivation. So hopefully that's a useful way to think about it. Now, before we go into the motivation models, though, it's good to think about, well, how would I use these models? So, and I think about this as almost being like a scientist. So for any scientists watching, I'm using that term loosely, but the first step here is you want to develop some sort of hypothesis um, for what you think the challenge is with the person's motivation. So, for example, you might say, okay, I think this team member is not motivated because they don't feel a sense of purpose in their role, or they don't have enough freedom, or are not taking enough ownership, and that might be why they're not motivated. So, when I say develop a hypothesis, I'm thinking, well, I want to come up with a theory on why I think that person is not motivated, and that's the starting point for using some of these models. Now, the second step there is to consider what result you're looking for. So if you believe that someone is not motivated because they don't have enough autonomy in their role, maybe they need a bit more freedom, then you could apply that freedom to them or give them a bit more leeway, for example. But you want to look at, okay, how will I know if this person is motivated now? What sort of signs am I looking for? So I think it's useful to think about that before you start to tinker with the environment in terms of motivational factors. So an example might be, well, I'd be looking for more engagement or more discretionary effort put in, which means that person is putting in effort over and above without being asked to put in that extra effort or to stay later. So I might see that. I might think an employee who's more motivated, looking for more attention to detail and taking a bit more care in their work. So I think it's useful to think about, oh, what are you actually looking for here? And in other words, how will you know whether that person is more motivated? And the third step in this section as well is to make an adjustment. So once you've developed your hypothesis, you think you know what sort of reaction you're looking for, then I would start to make adjustments to the environment or the way you deal with that team member to help them find their motivation. And that's probably the least that you don't want to tinker with too many things at once. It's good to isolate them a little bit so that you can try to see what's working and what's not. And the last step is simple, observing the impact of that. So the changes you've made, you want to see, okay, do I think there's a noticeable difference in motivation here, or should I try something else? Because as with all of these theories, they are generally universally accepted as factors that improve motivation, but every individual is different. So you can't just apply them and guarantee that this is going to work. So that's some steps there to think about how to apply these models. Now, well, actually, the first model I want to talk about here is motivator hygiene theory. Now, this is an old one. So it's a foundational theory that was developed in around 1965 by a researcher called Hertzberg. And it is an old model, but it's a foundational model, which means other models have used this as a foundation to base some of their research on. It is a simple one, but I quite like it because it still demonstrates one principle, which I think is useful to keep in mind. So when we see the line on the screen there, which represents base motivation. Now, base motivation is what I term as, okay, the person is coming to work, they're doing their work, they're not going over and above for you, but they're not falling behind. They're sort of giving you a reasonable level of performance, but they're not overly motivated or demotivated. So that's sort of what I would say term as base motivation. Now, in this research, or this model talks about two different factors. The first set of factors are called hygiene factors, and these are demotivators. Now, what these mean is if these factors are not present, then you're likely to see a lack of motivation. And some common examples of hygiene factors are salary is a big one. So a lot of people think that if you just pay people more and more and more, they get more and more motivated. But there's actually a limit to that. Generally, you need to pay people enough for them to feel like they're fairly compensated for the work that they do. But after that point, you're really only getting to this base level of motivation. you're not getting someone more and more motivated by paying them more and more and more. And so that's what's known as a hygiene factor. Now, another hygiene factor would be things like safety in the workplace. So if someone feels unsafe, whether it be psychological safety or physical safety, that's likely to be a big demotivator. But if you have the safest workplace in the world, you're not likely to see a great deal more motivation. There's a limit to the motivational potential of that factor. Other things to think about are the presence in the hygiene factor category, are the presence of processes and procedures, workplace policies, and just a nice working environment. All those sorts of things have been shown to be hygiene factors as well. So the lesson here is that we don't want the hygiene factors to be missing because we will lose motivation, but just having them is not enough to give people more motivation. So the second category here are the motivators. Now, the motivators are more intrinsic, which I mentioned earlier, so they're more internal to the person. And these are things like meaningful work, feeling like you're making a difference, interesting work that people enjoy, things like reward and recognition, giving people appreciation. All those sorts of things are motivators. You could also see, I mentioned salary before as a hygiene factor, so on the bottom half there, but actually you can also get motivation by giving bonuses and rewards like performance-based bonus. Like if you hit this target, then we'll get $1,000 or something like that. Now those can be motivational, and what the research has found is that the motivation of that bonus is actually, it's the recognition that that money represents, not necessarily just the money itself. So money can be a motivator in that way as well. So it shouldn't be ignored, but it's not so sustainable. If you have to give people lots and lots of money every time you want them to do something, it's likely to be an unsustainable situation. Most companies and industries can't do that. So that's motivator hygiene theory. Key takeaway here would be make sure the hygiene factors are in place to a suitable level, and then have your motivators as well. And we'll talk more about some motivators from different models in a minute. Just one thing before I finish this one, you might notice that the hygiene factors here are mostly organizational things. So the salary, the workplace conditions, health and safety, policies and procedures, these are things that generally your organization provides. They're not things that a manager generally can control completely. Whereas the motivators at the top here are they're often individually based. So a manager can give people more autonomy, can help people find interesting work, can increase their skills or help them find meaning in their work, for example. So those motivators are quite individually based, which is why you might see in one big company, and I've worked in a couple of big companies before, where if you talk to two different people in the organization, they have wildly different motivation levels and enjoyment of their job. And that is because of the individual manager that they're working for. And that's because the motivators are individually based. So let's go to the next one. Next one is the Drive. I'm calling it the Drive model. It's because Daniel Pink wrote a book called Drive in around 2008, which for motivation research is not too old. And in the research, he came across three major factors that he found were behind people's motivation, and these were intrinsic, so internal motivators. So the first one was a sense of purpose. Now, this is basically finding a sense of purpose and meaning in your work. So that would be being able to connect to the significance of the work that you're doing. So, for example, sometimes when I work with people in the healthcare industry, such as nurses, they have a very strong sense of purpose, and they're in a tough industry and they're under stress, but they often can connect quite well with their sense of purpose in their work because I'm a nurse, I treat my patient and I see them get better, and that's satisfying because I'm helping them. So in some other roles, it's harder to find the sense of purpose because let's say you're an accountant working for a hospital, you don't deal with the patients directly, and therefore it might be harder to connect to that sense of purpose. So some ideas for helping people find their sense of purpose would be getting them out and about to experience different parts of the organization. When I was in aged care, I worked in aged care for a couple of years. I found that in my day-to-day job, I did a lot of corporate projects and therefore I wasn't that connected. But once I got out and about to the residential facilities and the care facilities, I found I was working with the frontline staff and interacting with some of the residents. And I found I got more of a connection to that sense of purpose. So that could be things like volunteer opportunities in different parts of the organization. Basically, what you're trying to do is help your team or your team members connect to the impact that they're having so they can see that, hey, when I do this little piece of work here, makes a big difference to that person over there. So there's some ideas for purpose. Another one is autonomy. Now, autonomy is really useful in terms of just freedom, a sense of freedom in the work that you do. So you have decision-making authority. You can make decisions about how you go and do your work. So micromanagement would be the opposite of autonomy. So we want to reduce that. And we want to give our people a little bit of freedom. So even if you know that your team members have, well, they have these 10 things they have to do every day, you might say to them, hey, you decide the order in which you do those things, or you decide how you get those things done. That's what we mean by autonomy. People like to be able to choose what they're doing and how they do their work. And the last factor that Daniel Pink came across was mastery. And mastery is our desire to basically improve and get better at things that we care about. And so essentially, if you can help your team members learn new skills and yeah, develop new capabilities and build confidence in them, then you're likely to be able to harness this motivational factor as well. And this is why career, or this is why I think career development and career planning and helping your people have development plans and goals is really important because it incorporates the purpose. It gives people a sense of purpose so they know where they're heading. You know, they want to get a promotion or they want to get to, achieve this career goal or move into this different role that they're interested in. And mastery, they'll be learning new skills as they're progressing in their career as well. So if you can help them to do that, they're more likely to feel motivated as well. Now, one thing Daniel Pink does say as well, related to the previous model, motivator hygiene theory, is that you want to pay people enough to take the issue of money off the table. Essentially, that's referring to the hygiene factor of salary. So if people feel underpaid, for example, these sort of factors will have little effect. So the next or the last model I want to talk about here is from David Rock. So he's a neuroscientist, and in 2008, he released some studies that use brain imaging to determine the impact of certain social factors on motivation. And it's a really interesting one because they had neuroscience imaging, and basically they looked and they found that these social factors, which I'll talk about, which form the acronym SCARF, they actually had a similar impact as physical threats in the workplace or the environment as well. So, for example, if you get attacked by a lion, your fight or flight response will kick in, and these social factors had a similar type of engagement in terms of the brain activity. So let's look at some of these. But to start with, we'll look at a concept that underpins this as well. So there's two types of motivation you can think about as well in terms of it's either away or towards motivation. So away from motivation would be, well, there's a wolf, as shown on the slide there. There's something bad here, so I want to get away from it. So for example, there's a burning building. If I'm in the building, I want to get away from the fire. So I'm motivated to get away from something bad. Another way of thinking about motivation is towards motivation, which is, well, there's a benefit, so I'm going to go towards that benefit, which might be I'll get a reward or I'll get recognized or praise if I'll get praised if I do a good job. So that would be an example of towards motivation. And you might find yourself motivated more strongly one way or the other. Personally, I find myself away motivated quite a lot, not always, but a lot of the time. So all these factors I'm going to talk about now are underpinned by this away and towards aspect. So the first one is status. Now, status is basically your standing in relation to others in a similar group. So for example, if you're in a team and you get criticized in front of your colleagues, your status goes down in that group. And if you're in a tennis club and you win the prize for winning a tennis competition in your club, your status goes up. So status has been shown to be a big motivator or demotivator depending on, the situation. So status is the first one. So how would you leverage that? Well, you want to make sure that you're recognizing people in public forums if they are okay with that. Depends on the individual, but that can be a public way to do it, to give people praise in front of others. And you might limit the times that you give people constructive feedback in a group setting, for example, because that might reduce their status in front of others in the group. Then the second factor is certainty. So this is, well, uncertainty can be a huge demotivator. We see this when we see a lot of companies doing restructures or having redundancies or layoffs. They often are surrounded by a lot of uncertainty in that we don't know exactly the plan yet. We're working it out, and there might be some layoffs, but we don't know. All that sort of stuff is a huge demotivator for people. So if you can give people certainty, giving them a plan, giving them actions that they need to take and a timeline of when things will happen, that can be a motivator for people as well, or it can at least stop them feeling demotivated. Third one is autonomy. So we saw this in the previous model, the ability to choose how they do their work or make choices about what they do. Another one is relatedness. So this is about the tendency for them to feel like they belong as part of a group. So you could see this as belonging as well. So it links to status a little bit as well, but it's about being part of a group. So anything you can do to include people of all different types in the team and making sure you're creating an environment where everyone feels like they're included and not excluded, that would be harnessing the power of relatedness there. And the last factor in this model is fairness. So this one will be about making sure that there's fair outcomes. People aren't perceiving that there's unfair treatment or that person gets paid more than me. Why is that? All those sorts of things can cause a sense of unfairness, which could be a huge demotivator for certain people as well. So those 5 factors are some of the ones, the social factors that stimulate that brain activity, whether positive or negative. So I think this is a nice one as well to think about. So in general, there's a couple of factors I've given you today in those 3 models. So I'd start to think about, okay, if you've got a demotivated team member or you think someone could be a bit more motivated, a couple of things to think about. You might think, okay, is it the hygiene factors, like they're demotivated by something, or are they just not, or is there just not enough motivators for them, the positive factors such as the autonomy, fairness, or a sense of purpose or mastery, improving skills. So those are the sort of things I'd be looking at in terms of trying to harness some of these motivational factors as well. So we have reached the Q&A portion. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to stop the recording and I'll publish this on YouTube and I'll send out a link to that later just so people can have access to this if they can't make it to the session. So I'll stop the recording now, but I'm happy to take any questions you may have.